Right, so I'd like to welcome you all here to the second ANZAAS Zoom talk, and this talk will be by Dr. Anne-Marie Tosolini.
No trouble, thank you, David. This evening I'll be talking about fossil leaves from the Cretaceous to Paleogene polar environments. So I'll be describing what these terms mean and why it's so interesting to study these fossil leaves. So my name's Anne-Marie Tosolini from the School of Geography, Earth and Atmospheric Sciences at the University of Melbourne. For starters, I'll describe to you when is the Cretaceous period. A lot of you have probably heard of Jurassic Park and Jurassic World. So these films were set right back between about 150 and 200 million years ago. And the Cretaceous follows the Jurassic. And it's before the modern era of the Cenozoic. So the Cretaceous into the Paleogene, as it's called now, it used to be called the Tertiary, runs from about 145 million to about 23 million years ago. So it's a very big chunk of time. And it's a really fascinating time. The reason being that at this stage, we're seeing incredible evolution of lots of different life forms, not only within the plants themselves, but also within the vertebrates. And so it's a really interesting time of the rise of mammals at this stage, as well as the rise of the angiosperms, or the flowering plants. So I'll be looking at that as well. So when we're looking right back to the Cretaceous, my talk will be divided into two parts. I'll talk about the Cretaceous first, and then I'll talk about the Paleogene. So the Cretaceous fossils that we've collected have been from here within Australia, within Victoria, to the southeast and southwest of Melbourne. And then I'll be looking at the Paleogene from Antarctic fossils. You can see from these exceptional maps that there have been reconstructions of the geography through geological time. And so you can see all of the world's continents used to be joined up during the way back in the Permian, more than 250 million years ago, in a large supercontinent known as Pangaea. This started to break up. So through the Triassic, Jurassic and Cretaceous in the Mesozoic era, we're seeing Gondwana itself break up. So Australia was part of this southern hemisphere supercontinent, joined to India and Africa and South America. And they were all joined to Antarctica. So Antarctica was situated over the South Pole at that time, and it hasn't really moved for about 100 million years from this time. Australia, on the other hand, has broken off and taken a large, fast journey northward. During the Paleogene, however, we'll see that that is when Australia had already rifted away as well, from completely broken away from Antarctica, but South America was still joined. So the part of Antarctica I'll be looking at will be the Antarctic Peninsula over the other side near South America. So to start with, in the early Cretaceous, for the first part of the talk, this is when Gondwana is breaking up. And so Australia is breaking away from Antarctica. There would have been lots of upwelling in the mantle, and these magmas were then pushing the crust apart. So it's forming lots of volcanoes, which found to be erupting along that eastern side of Australia, up near Queensland, right down between New Zealand and Australia. And you can also see a rift starts to form between East Antarctic part of the continent and Australia, and between Australia and Tasmania even. So Tasmania would have been left behind had that rift eventually continued. At that time, all the volcanic material was being washed into this huge rift valley. So the initial rift phase is breaking apart of the land, sagging of the land, and so huge torrents of rivers bring in lots and lots of sedimentary material. And this rift was thought to have continued right until 90 million years. And so we've done a lot of work looking at the sediments themselves as well first, as well as the fossils that are held within them. So the sediments, to start with, today they are forming the Otway Ranges and the Strzelecki Ranges in Otways and Gippsland, but under the surface they extend right across Victoria and down into the Bass Strait. And we can see these really thick sequences. Would have been up to 3 kilometers thick of all of these sediments building up layer after layer over time. So we can actually peel back those layers and look at reading them like pages in a book and finding the fossils between the layers, and particularly in the dark mudstones, which represent more billabongs and floodplain areas. So we've got a lot of beautiful fossils from there. We can actually draw pictures of the different layers to compare them to modern sequences of the rocks. And this helps us to understand what kind of environment they were situated in, what kinds of rivers. So these are big, giant rivers starting off very, very fast flowing, just like in New Zealand today, with lots and lots of sedimentary material flushing in from the highlands. Then when the rift widened, they became very sluggish, meandering rivers until we see the third stage where they start to get very, very wide and braided and fast flowing again. So there are 3 stages of these evolution of the environment we can tell from the sediments through these early Cretaceous. So from about 130 to 100 million years, there are 3 stages. And so I'll talk about these in terms of the different fossils as well.
So we're hearing some background sound from somebody who needs to mute. Yeah, I'll see if I can mute them. Oh, there.
Thank you, David. So in Victoria, in Southeast Australia, we don't have any glacial deposits that indicate that there were glaciers around. There's certainly no ice caps that we see today over Antarctica and those high latitudes. So the only evidence is that there may have been some freezing and thawing seasonally at this time, but it was certainly a much, much warmer world. So the fossil plants can tell us a lot about the evolution of plants through history, but they can also tell us a lot about the environments they were growing in and the sort of ecosystems that we see. And importantly, they can tell us a lot about past climates as well. So I'll have a look at some of the fossils that we've been collecting from here in Victoria along the coast. We have these beautiful ferns, a whole different range of ferns that indicate lots of thick, lush undergrowth, and tree ferns as well. And they're very similar to ferns that are still existing today and still growing today. And there were a lot of liverworts, which represent very, very wet kinds of environments. So that would form the undergrowth. Within the mid-story, we're seeing a host of different plants that are actually extinct today. These are the most nearest living relative is known as the cycads, but the cycads themselves weren't around during the dinosaur time. So there were all these other kinds of fossils that we're seeing known as benatites and seed ferns. And we're seeing a very, very large diversity of these seed ferns forming the mid-story with these large trunks similar to cycads, but also some other very strange seed plants known as, which were related to the modern ginkgo that we see. We see one last remaining species known as Ginkgo biloba, the Chinese maidenhair tree. But these fossils were actually represented right across Gondwana. And interesting that their leaves were more palmate, that shape, very quite different shape to the modern species. Within the forest canopy, we're seeing beautiful large conifers and tiny small conifer leaf bracts that were very similar to the conifers growing within Tasmania and New Zealand today. So we're seeing the podocarps, known as the mountain plum pines, and we're also seeing relatives of the Araucaria, or what we call the bunya pines in Queensland, the hoop pines in Tasmania, or the kauri pines in New Zealand. And this is a monkey puzzle from South America as well. So these were the very, very large trees with huge tree trunks and wood that's also preserved. Now, amazingly, at this time, as I said, it's a very important time in plant evolution, and probably the biggest event within the last 200 million years. was the evolution of flowers and flowering plants. So Darwin himself talked about this. Where did the flowers come from? How did they diversify and become so abundant? So they form 70% of the modern flora today. And he termed it an abominable mystery. And the first earliest flowering plants have been found, or most commonly accepted and definitive of the flowering plants, is this oldest flower from Gippsland here in Victoria, recognised within lake sediments. And they were very small and herb-like. And since then, there's been a lot of studies done to show that they were actually quite living in quite dark and disturbed environments. And that makes sense as well for where they're growing within the Rift Valley in Southeast Australia. So we're seeing a lot of these very soft, there's no woody structures from the flowering plants in the early Cretaceous. And the pollen is actually very evolutionary, quite different to what we're seeing in the plants today. So it was known as the basal angiosperms. So in fact, the studies have shown that their most nearest living relative is known as the magnolia kind of group. And studies have also shown, this is from Sorke from the Royal Botanic Gardens in Sydney, and they show that a lot of the earliest flowers were actually quite small, probably white, very similar to a magnolia today. But we've done a lot of work looking at how did they get to Australia. And so the oldest pollen and some of the oldest flowering structures and leaves have been found from Asia. So it's thought that they were evolving in the very warm temperatures around the equator. Most of the evidence originally was from our work, and a lot of work before ours was actually pointing to South America having much more of the modern evolved, what we call the eudicots, most of the flora that we see today, flowering plants we see today. So if they had them in South America before Australia, it seemed to make more sense that they might have diversified and adapted to move around Northern Hemisphere first, and then down through Africa and South America to reach Antarctica before they even reached Australia. But recent work by Cretaceous and Wagstaff just last year has been published to show that of course, probably the simplest solution is the most likely solution. And so they've actually found the pollen occurring simultaneously in Queensland and Australia and Southeast Australia in the early Aptian as the oldest forms. Then some of the more evolved forms arriving in Queensland before Southeast Australia. And so there was a bit of a missed stage there. We now have these 3 stages of evolution of the flowering plants as well, to show us that the most likely solution would they'd be arriving from Asia.
Could I just ask, the Wollemi pine, where does that fit in? What sort of flowering plant is that?
That's a really good question, David. So that would have been forming these, I'll just flick through a bit more. Here we go, the canopy. These are related to those bunya and monkey puzzle trees that we see, known as the Araucariaceae family. So they're conifers with large seed cones, pine cones, but they don't have the true flowers. And same with the ginkgos, that they're not true flowering plants. So we're seeing them form, the Wollemis were certainly around, and in the fossil record, they were recognised first from fossils alone until they were discovered just outside of Sydney in the Blue Mountains. So a really fascinating other story there as well. So we've been able to divide up all of the different fossil floras into 3 time slices. The earliest part of the early Cretaceous, there were no flowering plants. It was very similar kinds of forests that were growing back in the Jurassic and Triassic. So there were loads of seed ferns, loads of conifers, and they were really lush forests that were quite wet, despite being over higher than 70 degrees latitude down close to the South Pole. And the conifers were quite fine-leaved, probably more similar to the pine trees that grow up in the taiga forests up in the Northern Hemisphere. So we have no modern equivalents for that. During the middle time slice, that's when we're seeing those first flowers around the world and the first pollen. And the conifers seem to grow much tighter, smaller leaves. And so it's indicating much more of the colder climates. And that's when we're starting to see the freeze thaw kinds of cycles in the sediments as well within these big lake systems. So the Rift Valley is quite wide at this stage. The final stage in the early Cretaceous polar forests is where there's much bigger broadleafed, those wollamais or bunya pines are growing now with really big, large trees, probably on the high ground. And then down in the floodplains, we're seeing billabongs, not so much of the lakes anymore, much faster rivers again. But it's showing much, much warmer kinds of environments with these beautiful spores from ferns and lycopods that really rely on the water. And so there's lots of water environments. So this is where the flowering plants were able to diversify for the first time. And so we now have up to 23 different species from this time slice. So you can see how rapidly they have evolved at this time.
Can I also ask, the coal in the Latrobe Valley, is that from these plants or from later plants or from earlier plants?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point as well, David. We've got the oldest black coal is from these sequences, and that was originally used for electricity around Cape Patterson and the Wonthaggi black coal mine, which is now a fantastic historic site. You can go down and actually see the quite thick coal seams, but it's quite black. But it's nowhere near the thickness of the main ones that we use today. The brown coal is hasn't been buried as much younger. It's from Oligocene and Miocene, so it's somewhere around 35 to 15 million years ago, much younger. So within the black coal, unfortunately, we don't have any of the plant material preserved anymore. But certainly recently I've been studying, along with Vera Coloricidis, looking at the plants material that's actually, you can still peel off the layers within the brown coal. And Vera's been studying the spore pollen. So she's got a fantastic story coming out of that Miocene coal.
There's also a question in the chat. What was the evolutionary pressure that led to the angiosperms? Are they better adapted to warmer climate compared to gymnosperms? Was it a climate adaptation or sexual dimorphism leading to greater genetic diversity?
Yeah, fascinating question, because these are the sorts of things that have been studied, and thankfully there are some answers coming out in the last 10 to 15 years, really, in the literature. So what's thought to have been the original very basal kinds of flowering plants that evolved, they were just so weedy. They could only really scramble around close to the water or in very disturbed environments. So it was thought that some kind of disruptions were going on to the nice evolutionary evolved conifers at that time. And so these little plants were able to come in initially in the Aptian, but it was really in the Albian there must have been a lot more of this disruption, and certainly going from the colder environments from the middle stage into those much warmer parts of the later part of the early Cretaceous. So we're seeing potentially a bit of climate helping them out for sure. And so then by the late half of the Cretaceous, we're seeing these flowering plants actually push out a lot of those seed plants, those ones that were the Benatites and cycad relatives. They actually end up becoming extinct in the late Cretaceous. So the angiosperms really rose to dominance. And one of the aspects that was thought to have led to that, rather than sexual dimorphism, because the gymnosperms, the conifers and seed ferns also have sexual dimorphism, but rather it was their leaves. they have veins along their leaves, you can see in the right-hand picture, that just allow, it's so much higher density per square inch on their leaf surface, that it enabled them to really utilize the sunlight and photosynthesize in a much better and more efficient way. So it's thought that maybe this was the driver of them being able to outcompete those cycads. So what happened to during that whole early Cretaceous? We're seeing the decline of those strange ginkgo and seed ferns, like the cycads. We're seeing diversification and dominance of much broader leafed conifers. We're seeing large spored ferns also diversify at this time. And then the flowering plants bursting onto the scene, and 23 different species that Vera's described coming from South America and Antarctica. Thought to have migrated, but now we're seeing that changed last year with the paper from looking at potentially more likely to have come from Asia. So no evidence of ice caps and glaciers. So it's quite different to how we envisage Antarctica today. There are some glacial deposits from Queensland. Even though it's further north, it's probably just sediments that are recorded from closer to the mountains, so much higher altitude. And we're seeing that these forests covering Antarctica at that time in the early Cretaceous were so warm and very, very similar to the lush kinds of cool temperate rainforests we're seeing in New Zealand and Tasmania, just without the woody flowering plants. So none of the Nothofagus southern beech, but we're seeing those big conifers, lots of tree ferns and lots of lush ferns in the undergrowth and wet kinds of mosses. And here's a beautiful reconstruction from Dr. Peter Trusler, who is not just a scientist, he's an artist of these spectacular dinosaur finds. And so when he drew this recent D. Pickeringi, so quite a small dinosaur, he put in the attention to detail of some of these large conifers and new seedlings growing around the base of the close to the river systems. So our environmental interpretation then is having the conifers growing right up in the edges of these large rivers, more in the higher areas. We're seeing the podocarps, the mountain plum pines, more on the floodplain, and then the little flowering plants and cycads and ferns being in that lush ecosystems around those billabongs, away from that main channel, which was braided rivers, much higher energy rivers. We also actually have spores that come from marine algae at this time in the late part of that first half of the Cretaceous, the early Cretaceous. So this is the first time it's been indicated that the sea was actually coming in, and this is becoming coastal at this time. So it's at least 10 million years younger, older, I beg your pardon, earlier than what has been recorded in the past. So during the Cretaceous, Victoria was within higher than 70 degrees south latitude. You can see the red dotted lines showing. And so it was much further south than Queensland, but that's where we're getting those three major time slices of the evolution of the forests, the different kinds of environments we talked about. So what does that tell us about the climate? We are seeing much, much warmer climates in the Cretaceous. A lot of sediments have indicated from isotope studies that the carbon dioxide was at least double what it is today. So we're seeing over 400 parts per million today. It was at least 800, possibly over 1,000 parts per million. And really fascinating to also see that the latitudinal difference between the equator and the poles was so much less than what we're seeing today. So you see this on the right-hand side, the fuzzy gray curve showing huge difference between 28 to 30 degrees mean annual temperatures at the pole, at the equator, of course, 0 negative even down at the poles, whereas the dotted green line shows the mid-Cretaceous at this time. And so it was just a lot less difference between the equator and poles at that time. Okay, and that dramatically warmed again into the late Cretaceous, as you can see with the yellow dashed line there. So most of the sediments and the floras that we've looked at from the Cretaceous here in Southeast Australia, situated quite close to the poles at that time, showing a mean annual temperature around 10 degrees, much, much warmer than today. But then if it's so high latitude, what we're seeing today is that there's months and months of darkness. So how did these creatures survive? And yes, there were dinosaurs, but also evolving, as I said, with those tiny little mammals. So some of the earliest skulls of mammals are coming out of Victoria here, and they're tiny, smaller than a thumbtack, and also these beautiful feathers being preserved from the lake sediments here, showing that birds and also some of the dinosaurs had these feathers. So they must have been migratory, but they could have also had a lot of different kinds of fur and feathers to allow them to survive these cooler temperatures during the winter. Some of the dinosaurs had larger orbits to their eyes. So this is work done by Pat Vickers-Rich and Tom Rich from Museum in Swinburne, and Stephen Poropat, who's also at Swinburne. And so they studied these tiny little chicken-sized dinosaurs. There's also some large predators, which are pretty exciting. But the plants, how would they can't just up and migrate away or warm themselves up during winter. So how would they have survived darkness and cold temperatures? And so some studies have also been done looking at trying to grow modern plants that are nearest living relatives. Those Wollemi pine type conifers can actually go dormant. And so a lot of the wood that's being collected from Antarctica actually shows this dormancy. And so they were able to grow quite far apart, like we're seeing in the forests in the Arctic today. So that brings me to the end of the discussion about the Cretaceous, and I'm going to move time now into after the extinction of the dinosaurs from about 66 million to about 23 million years ago, and have a focus now at some of the plants we've collected, fossil plants rather, from Antarctic Peninsula. So I managed to, I was very lucky and fortunate to go down to Antarctica when I was working in Leeds and Cambridge. And so we went to this tiny little island named Seymour Island. You can see that the Larsen ice shelf retreated from there in the 80s, leaving the bare rock exposed. But there was also bare rock exposed for quite a long time. And the Swedish South Polar Expedition went down there, ventured down there in 1901 to 1903, led by Otto von Nordenskjold. And he was the first to collect fossil plants from Antarctica, or one of the first. He first to collect fossil leaves. There had been wood collected in this area as well, near the Antarctic Peninsula. So it's 64 degrees south today. And back 50 to 60 million years ago, it was about the same latitude. So here's a map from one of our papers. We studied this region in the middle of Seymour Island, and it has the bright yellow kind of sediments, which look like this. On the top there, it was a really thick sequence again of lots of mudstones this time. So you can see that the mud, when the river was flowing, was causing us a lot of problems with our all-terrain vehicles, and so we managed to get bogged, but we needed those to cart the fossils back to camp, where we were collected by helicopter. So you can see us collecting the fossils up the top there. And thankfully it wasn't all work. Sometimes we managed to chill out. So what did we collect? We collected a lot of wood, which shows large conifers again in the canopy, but this time we also have a lot of big trees growing from those flowering plants. And these flowering plants, as we'll see, are related to some of the modern flora that we see in Australia today and think of as very quintessentially Australian. So again, we're seeing beautiful ferns, although not as diverse as in the Cretaceous. There's a little diversity in the conifers as well, and not any of those seed plants had survived. The angiosperms on the other side, the flowering plants, we're seeing 36 different kinds of taxa, and we could divide them based on their margin. And so I'll show you a couple of beautiful pictures. Here's a fern and one of those large bunya style pines or monkey puzzle trees. Here's some thick woody trunks that just look like modern wood, but when you pick them up, they're heavy. They've turned to stone. And so they're related to existing living fossils. And here's just a few of those amazing diversity of the flowering plants at that time. And as I explained, really, when we look at their modern relatives, we can see the Nothofagus southern beech, which grows across southern Victoria in Tarrabolga National Park, or the Otways National Park. They grow in New Zealand, they grow in South America and in Tasmania. Interestingly, we've got some that just are very similar to evergreen trees. A lot of these conifers would have been evergreen. Some of these flowering plants were even evergreen. But we've also got these, can I go back? Yes. Down in the middle, you can see this tiny little leaf on the bottom, and it's actually kind of crinkled. And so that tells us that it's related to the modern Tasmanian southern beech that grow in colder areas, and it's actually deciduous. And so they are famous for their beautiful colors of these Nothofagus as in the autumn. Interestingly, also, we've got more subtropical kinds of cinnamon relatives. We've got relatives of fire trees, the brachychiton. We've got relatives of the protea kinds of trees that are growing, and we think of the Banksia as being one of the quintessential Australian floras today. So really quite remarkable how ancient some of these families are, and they're going right back into the Cretaceous, some of them, and they were spread right across the southern Gondwanan continents.
When did the eucalypts appear?
That's a very good question as well. So the eucalypts are first recognized from Australia somewhere around much younger, about 25 million years ago, but their relatives are certainly quite diverse prior to that. And there has been the oldest eucalypt actually recognized from South America. So that fossil is even older. It's from the Eocene, which is somewhere around 40 million years ago. So it's really remarkable that they were spread right across South America, Antarctica, and Australia. What about the animals down in Antarctica? They were very similar to South America as well. Living within the forests, penguins were up to 2 meters high. So emperor penguins today can grow to about 1 meter. And so these were 2 meter high penguins, really extraordinary. The emu relatives, similar to the rhea that is extinct from South America now, were surviving at that time. And some other ungates, which are, cow-like herbivore type things. There were opossums, there were lots of birds. So it was really, really diverse fauna living in these lush forests. So we've got in the drawing as well from the South Americans, Marcelo Reguero et al. He's done this beautiful image with the large conifer trees, the monkey puzzles, as well as those southern beech forests. And the southern beech fossils, it survived in Antarctica right up until only 3 million years ago, right through all of that development of the ice sheets. So what else I did, apart from looking at the different kinds of fossil leaves, we actually were able to look at their climate interpretations. And so what we needed to do was to statistically analyze the different kinds of morphologies or characters of each of the leaves. We could look at the leaf shape, the leaf size, if they had teeth or no teeth. So it was a multivariate kind of statistical analysis of these leaves. And what it told us was that the mean annual temperatures were much, much warmer again than today, somewhere in the vicinity I can't even read that now. I have to try to move my, for some reason it won't click. So they're the mean annual temperatures, which have just escaped my memory for this second, and I hope you can read them.
Yeah, we can.
As well as the precipitation, obviously much different to our desert Antarctic that we see today. So these Paleogene forests, very similar to South American kinds that we're seeing right down into Patagonia today. They were quite close to a lot of volcanoes that were around at the time as well. And so we can see that the older 56 million year old floras were somewhere a mean annual temperature roughly about 13 degrees Celsius. So it's much, much warmer than what we see today. And then we see a bit of a cooling into the Eocene. So we saw a much greater warming over the Paleocene and Eocene, into the Eocene, early part of the Eocene. And then we have a flora from middle Eocene to late Eocene. And so that's much cooler. So that time around just after the Cross Valley flora is one of the most dramatic warmings in Earth's history, known as the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum. There was a huge release of carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere at that time. And so it's a worldwide event of warming, dramatic warming, and very, very rapid for geological time. So the Paleocene-Eocene is a time that we can study all over the world to try to help understand these natural systems and these climate changes and help us to hopefully to mitigate against future climate change as well. So this is where it's the cooling history. You can see the Cretaceous Paleogene boundary down the bottom is where the extinction of the dinosaurs occurred. And you can see warmer to the left and colder to the right. The Cretaceous, you can see the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum as a quite a dramatic warming event. And then the early Eocene was the most recent greenhouse climate, and before we start to see cooling. And it wasn't until South America broke away from Antarctica that the ice sheets were actually able to grow from about 35 million years ago from the Oligocene and Miocene onwards. So that's where we're seeing dramatic cooling. And so this kind of information comes from the oxygen isotopes preserved within the rocks themselves, as well as fossils. So what have we seen over the last 66 to even 100 million years? We've seen a warming event across Australia and Antarctica in the Southern Hemisphere. At high latitudes, there were no ice sheets across Antarctica until 35 million years ago. And so we've seen this dramatic cooling through the Cenozoic to today. But what we are starting to see, of course, is that transfer of the system back towards an interglacial event, when we should be heading into more glacial time period again. And so what we don't want to see is that kind of greenhouse warming occurring again. So you can see here plotted the release of greenhouse gases during that Paleocene-Eocene rapid dramatic warming event in the blue line. And it shows how much carbon was released, and it was extremely short, and it's thought to have been even less than 10,000 years now. But I couldn't find a nice new graph to show that, but this one shows it released over about 20,000 years. And so you can compare to that with what we are doing today. This is in the red with the modern, fueled by high emission rates. We're seeing global temperature rising very, very quickly, and already seeing 1 degree of warming. It will increase to 2 degrees of warming over a mere 200 years. And so we really need to focus on reducing this in the future. So this is unprecedented kind of warming in any of the geological records through Earth's history, where the recent IPCC report that came out just this year, just last month, this month, was the CO2 levels are the highest for 2 million years. And when you think that our genus Homo has only been around on Earth for 2 million years. These are the kinds of conditions that we've needed to survive. And so we're really, it's really critical that we're putting all our resources into mitigating against this into the future. So I hope you've enjoyed the journey, looking right back into Earth's history, and particularly those polar forests that we've been able to determine from the fossil plants, looking at not just the evolution of plants and that amazing, abominable mystery of Charles Darwin's, looking at the flowering plant evolution through the Cretaceous, but also understanding the past environments and particularly past climates. That's so important for understanding our future. So I'd also like to thank all of the people in my research group at University of Melbourne and my collaborators. And I'd like to thank you again, David, for having me today. And I see there's a few questions popping up in the chat, so I'm happy to answer more questions. Thank you.
Right. Well, that was absolutely wonderful, Anne-Marie. I'll take Chairman's privilege and ask you a couple of questions to begin with. So for those of us who can't get to the Antarctic Peninsula to look for fossils, where would you recommend a place to go in Victoria where somebody might find fossil leaves or fossils of any sort?
Absolutely. There's right along the coast of the Otways and Gippsland, there's spectacular cliffs. So as long as you're staying away from the overhanging areas, there are some loose material that you can collect and hammer open. There's a fabulous centre down at Inverloch run by Mike Cleland, and he takes groups out as well if you want a bit of a hand looking for dinosaur fossils or plant fossils as well. So he's a great contact to have. Also, there's lots of amazing fossils which are much younger around the Torquay and all the way to Aries Inlet kind of area. There's some beautiful limestones, so you can easily collect fossil shells. And even just closer by in Mornington, there's similar aged limestones down there. They've been collecting amazing shark and whale bones from down at Beaumaris with the museum. So that's Eric Fitzgerald. So there's, some fabulous fossils around that region. You can walk along the beach and, as long as you're not digging into the cliffs there, but you can just collect sea urchin fossils and all sorts of, bivalves and shells.
There's a question from Bob Aikenhead. He says, we've got temperature records from oxygen isotope ratios, but how are the concurrent CO2 levels determined?
So there's, that's a very good question. We've got the record that I showed was oxygen isotopes. And so we can look at that from, when we're looking at it from the limestone, it actually is telling you how much carbon dioxide is in the atmosphere as well, because that's drawing down into the limestone. So it's sort of understanding that carbon cycle for one. But particularly from the land point of view, the plants themselves can actually give information about the carbon dioxide levels as well. So there's been a link found between the pores on the leaf surface known as stomata. And so these pores, the plants use, they can open and close them, and they use it for transpiration. And so the density of these pores on the leaf surface is actually correlated with the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So we've been able to look at the lots of different proxies. The ice during the time that Antarctica has had ice sheets, we can drill down into the ice and you can actually get little bubbles of the atmosphere. So that's right back to about at least 25 million years, as well as those, as I said, the limestones in the bottom of the ocean and in caves, and fossils themselves also hold a lot of indication about carbon dioxide. So there, it's complicated, and like you say, it tells you, it can tell you a lot about how much oxygen is in the air, but that's not necessarily directly related to how much carbon dioxide.
Are there any patterns in the evolution of plant height or forest stories? So I'll read that again. Are there any patterns in the evolution of plant height or forest stories?
That's another really good question. Thank you. Well, if we think of plant evolution overall on the land, then absolutely there's obviously they started off quite small and they grew quite big, but the canopy size or of the trees really depends more on the type. So the conifers are able to grow, usually able to grow bigger than the flowering plants, although of course we have the mountain ash here in Victoria, which are the tallest of the flowering plant trees in the world. So I think it's more to do with the rainfall and climate, so rather than the type there. So I think it's changed up and down over the time. And yeah, the different kinds of stories within each of the forests gets much more complicated to do with, again, rainfall and latitude, because they're much more complex in the equatorial tropical forests than they are in these kinds of high latitude polar forests. Yeah, so similar to what you see in the taiga forests today. There's not much in the mid-story and there's not much in the undergrowth, in fact.
And where in Victoria would be the best places to look for or see Indigenous myrtle beech or araucaria?
Oh, yes. So the araucaria isn't growing anymore in Victoria, unfortunately. So you would need to go to the botanical gardens. They have some spectacular big trees there, the Wallamai and the bunya-bunyas and the Norfolk Island pines and Carry pines. So in Tasmania, there are hoop pines though. So you can go to like Tarkine, for example. If you wanted to see the bunya-bunya and Norfolk Island pines, they're more up in Queensland now. And the Carry pines grow in the North Islands, I think it is, of New Zealand. For the Nothofagus southern beech, though, we do have Nothofagus cunninghamii here in Victoria. So go to Mate's Rest in the Otways or any of those Otway very, very wet parts of the forest there. In Gippsland, it's called Tarabulga National Park, and there are some, again, the wettest parts. They're surrounded by the mountain ash, but in the wettest parts, you get thick tree ferns and these southern beech. And again, they're growing in Tasmania and New Zealand.